Welcome to Polaris Live, conversations on the U.S.-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Viewers may ask questions using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. The United States presidential elections of November 5th, 2024, are now being called the most important strategic signal for the future direction of U.S. domestic and foreign policy in generations. For this reason, Polaris Live will focus its autumn programming on the impact of the elections and their result on the most consequential relationship of our time, that between the United States and the People's Republic of China. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, and my guest today is Dartmouth College's Dr. Pamela Crossley, one of America's most noted China historians. Pamela Crossley is a specialist in the history of China's last empire, the Qing, but has written books on early, modern, and modern Chinese history. Widely published both in scholarly journals and in newspapers and magazines for the general public. Her forthcoming book is China's Global Empire, Qing, 1636-1912, from Cambridge University Press. She is freshly retired from Dartmouth College. We've asked Dr. Crossley to help us understand the U.S. elections from the perspective of China's long history of interacting with the West, especially during the 19th century when officials of the Qing dynasty first encountered the United States. Welcome back to Polaris Live, Dr. Crossley.
Thanks. It's really nice to see you.
You've pointed out that China's officials first encountered Americans in the 19th century during the Qing dynasty. They found Americans very different from the other Westerners, especially the British. How so?
They did first encounter them at the end of the 18th century, but it took a while, I do believe, to begin to distinguish the Americans as a kind of commercial presence from the British. And there were a lot of reasons why the confusion persisted, but I would say certainly by the 1810s, it was very clear what the differences were, and the Americans had very different economic interests, strategies, and they tended to pay in cash. So they sort of they were in good odor with the Chinese merchants. I'm talking now before the Opium War in 1839. So between 1784 and 1839, I think this gradually sort of emerged that there was a big distinction to be made between the Americans and the British, and then of course between both of them and the rest of the Europeans. It's really in the later 19th century, after two civil wars, the big enormous civil war in China, the largest anywhere up to that time, and then the American Civil War. It's in those post-Civil War eras that the United States and China first develop a very distinctive kind of relationship. The 1870s were very important, but that kind of, it developed over the course of the 19th century, and I think laid the foundation for the very big role played by the United States in Republican Chinese Republican history after 19.
When you say distinctive role, that they developed a distinctive role, I mean, it seems to me they were trading, the Brits were trading, the Germans were trading. What makes it distinctive?
Well, from the beginning, it became clear to the merchants at Guangzhou who were always dealing with these people that the British were the British East India Company. It was the biggest, most dominant foreign entity at Guangzhou. And the Americans were constantly struggling to get around it, take advantage of it, go around the edges, get themselves into the trade. I mean, they were very clearly competing against the British East India Company and also against French merchants in the earlier 19th century. It was just very clear that they were achieving different things. They were pushing different products. The American connection with the fur trade, for instance, was slightly special. And the merchants at Guangzhou had to be very clear where everybody was from, because if you didn't pay them, they would try to pursue you in your own courts. So they were the Guangzhou merchants were often suing American merchants, and they knew that for that you had to go to Boston, you had to go to Philadelphia, or you had to write to the President of the United States, which they also did, to complain about Americans not paying you. It didn't do to not know where people were from, right? Because you had to go and sort of do these kind of things. The real distinction. So I think it was also in this period that the firms at Guangzhou, the Hong, some of them, including the leading one of Wu Bingjian or Haokua, developed very close relationships with American firms and families, multidimensional, personal, familial, financial, every which way, closer than what they had developed with British firms. Now, in the 1840s, yes, the Americans signed an unequal treaty, the second of the unequal treaties, and they become part of this whole chain of most favored nation privileges that were passed along. But in 1869, the United States signed this very distinctive treaty with China that essentially took America out of the unequal treaty system. And it lasted for a little over a decade, and then was pretty much destroyed by racist reaction in the United States against Chinese labor.
Let me interrupt. Sorry. Let me interrupt, because I've often wondered if the fact that Britain was part of the continental foreign policy drama was used to dealing with other nations. And America was not, because we were then, as you've pointed out many times, just a number of boats bobbing in the water. Was that also a distinctive feature of the relationship at that time? The lack of American experience in creating a foreign policy.
Well, I'm not a specialist on American history, but from what I know, particularly in this context, the United States, I mean, the entire period of the war for independence, which was a prolonged war, the war was generated out of these other major wars that were already going on between Britain and France, basically. And to survive through the war, to resolve the war, as they did in 1783, the Americans had to become very, very adept at foreign relations very quickly. This is part of the whole legend of Benjamin Franklin, right? I mean, they had to do that. Now, they couldn't possibly play the kind of role that Britain or France would play, which is superpowers. You just come in and you sort of begin to say how things will be.
Right.
Americans were never in a position to do that, but they had to understand how to, how jujitsu works, as it were, in foreign diplomacy. And that's very much the way they behaved at Guangzhou. It was. I mean, the same way that they had to maneuver things around in France and in London, in Paris and in London, they also had to maneuver their way in Guangzhou. So they were very good at the game that they had to play. But it was a very different game from what Britain and France were playing, because of their own land engagement in India and this kind of way it affected their commercial relationships in other parts of Asia.
But Pamela, let me ask you, these were also formative years for China, right? The Chinese in increasing numbers were traveling to America, studying, going back. Did China at that point already have a system for systematically deciding and creating foreign policy?
Well, no, I mean, the Qing Empire, I mean, I think all empires are more or less, even if they state principles and they say they have systems, they really have ad hoc responses to their changing strategic interests. And that's exactly what happened with the Qing Empire, which is, this a little, it's unfortunate that somehow or other, what has got mixed up in our discourse is this idea that Qing had a system, that somehow they expected everybody to conform to this system, that the system could not be altered. There absolutely was not anything like that. And so by the time you get to the appearance of the Americans in Guangzhou, that's, basically a century and a half after the British have already been there. There are procedures and practices and hierarchies at Guangzhou, but it's not part of an imperial sort of system that is somehow or other is determining exactly how all these foreign nations will act in relation to China at any particular time.
This is important, I thought, asking you because, at some point, China started to think about what a change in leadership in Britain. I'm trying to figure out when they got to the stage that they would sit down and say, okay, so we're going to get a new queen, or we're going to get a new foreign minister. What kind of expectations? When do they get to this stage?
It evolves. There's never any point at which they're completely ignorant, right? I mean, even if you think in terms of the Macartney mission of 1792-93, the emperor wrote a letter to the king, right, of England, as he was thinking of it, and he had to know who it was and what his powers were. I mean, in a very, very basic way, right? And so what happens really is that in this post-Civil War era that I'm speaking of, both post-Civil War, both for China and for the United States, latter part of the 19th century, that is when China begins to establish specifically diplomatic institutions in which at that point they do begin to gather information in a more systematic way. They had just gathered information. All across Asia, there were Chinese merchants who could always submit a lot of information about what was happening in a certain place at a certain time. There were always visitors to Beijing who could be debriefed about, what's going on in your country, and that did happen. But in terms of establishing institutions for doing this and systematic collection of information and systematic communications with foreign nations, it happens in the 1860s. And then in the 1870s is when this distinctive relationship between the United States and China sort of reaches a greater degree of formalization. But it had been developing over the course of the 19th century.
Okay. I would just want to take a moment, Pamela, and remind our viewers that Polaris Live is entirely viewer supported. We'd appreciate your signing up to our mailing list at Kashmeri, KASHMERI.com, and to our YouTube channel, www.polaris-live.com. There's no cost, and it really does help us. A quick stop, Pamela, in the Nixon opening up China period. Was this driven by a shrewd policy of trying to break up the Soviet-China axis, or was it simply a desire to get into the lucrative China trade that characterized Japan and Germany, make money, in other words?
All these things. Other countries were already in China in this very early period of the opening up, of the reform. They were already there. Germany was there. Japan was there. Canada, Australia. The American merchants very much wanted to get in on their own terms. That was sort of in the background. There'd been pressure of that for a long time. Now, there was a political crisis in China because of the Cultural Revolution. There was a political crisis here because of the Vietnam War. And it just, I think, creates more explicit, more acute pressures to actually do something about this. So when it became clear through these communications through Pakistan that, yeah, Nixon would like to do this, and Mao Zedong, particularly Zhou Enlai, would like to do this, they moved forward. But it was in the interest of both the countries, I would say the leadership of both countries, and the time was right.
So it's fair to say that that trade has really been the center of gravity for a long time in the relationship. I wanted to just make that, have you talk about that, because I'd like to now take everything we've discussed and put it into the context of today. Not easy to do, Pamela, but especially without getting into the two contenders for the presidency of the United States. But how do you think China is going about setting up expectations? What do you think is happening on the other side? I mean, like many people, I'm perplexed. This is they say a generationally important election that's coming up. How do you think that they're positioning or trying to position themselves to deal with whatever formality comes up?
How are they trying to position themselves? Well, it's a very, very interesting question, because there is a certain amount that is unknowable to us in real time. I mean, there are people who do know some things in real time, but I don't believe anybody in the U.S. government ever knows as much as they would like to know about what is happening in China in real time. But there are conflicting trends, there are conflicting interests, and I think Xi Jinping's ideological position has been very clear since 2013, which is that China has to position itself as the coming world power, economically, militarily, and probably culturally. And that's just been his, we think of these as moonshot, right? Plans. Not that he thought that it had happened already or that it's happened now, but that this is the trajectory that you want to be on. And in relation to the United States, in terms of his ideology, his public presentation, it's been that what we have to do is get the United States to reconcile themselves to this. And sometimes add something like, "Oh, we understand how difficult it'll be for them to accept this," but to continue on this path sort of unswervingly. So we're going to become, internationally persuasive through something like the Belt and Road Initiative, and the United States is just going to have to accept that they're declining power, their days are over. They're going to have to just sort of fade into the chorus while we do our star turn. And okay, that's been the sort of open frontline ideological position. Behind the scenes, there's lots and lots of complexity about this, and hesitation from many parts of the Chinese government and the military, and so there isn't universal agreement, and so the signals that you get from China are not always very, very clear. And in fact, as time goes on, I think Xi Jinping's position becomes more complex politically, not more simple. And so the pressure on him to kind of put some nuance and some sort of more qualification into this message, I think it comes internally as well as externally. Now, the past 4 years, or the 3.5 years, I think have been times when there's a lot going on in China and there's a lot going on in the United States. And the two countries have not particularly applied themselves to developing their own relationship. I mean, things are kind of sort of hanging. No crises, that's fine in terms of that relationship, but lots of crises at home for each of these countries. So I think I think what is interesting about the Jake Sullivan trip and plans maybe for one would hope Xi Jinping to come to the United States. But anyway, the Sullivan trip is that it does come at what everybody feels is a transitional time, particularly for the United States, and that a lot of very
You really believe the Chinese understand that, Pamela?
no,
Because
well, no, I don't actually. But then that's only because I don't see the most secret kind of memos that are sent by people in the Chinese government
right.
who may actually have very, very good information about the United States and know how to interpret it. I assume there are people there who can do that. But what you normally get coming out, from people like Wang Huning and this is these kind of analyses that don't show any kind of serious understanding of what's happening in the United States, other than keeping with the Xi Jinping line that it's a degenerate society, that this is everything is a sign of decline. It's a society that is so violent, so internally conflicted that daily life is a problem. It doesn't, so no, I don't think there is an understanding, and I've felt this for a few years now as it becomes increasingly clear. This much has been clear under the Biden administration, which is that support for existing democracies, places where people have chosen democracy, is necessarily an organic part of American foreign policy at this time.
Even though we may not follow our own principles all the time, that is kind of a organic, built in the DNA kind of policy.
No, I don't think that. I mean, first part, yes, nobody follows all their policies, all their principles all the time. And certainly the United States has never followed all its principles all the time. I'm saying at this moment, it is particularly urgent that the struggle for democracy in the United States is organically connected to a foreign policy commitment to existing democracies elsewhere. And this is one of the things that I think is not well understood in the Chinese government, that this is not just like any other moment for the United States. And this may not be exactly the time to try to challenge the United States on this, because this isn't really a kind of choice that one might make in more normal times between, oh, let's just follow our principle, or let's just follow, our realistic interests. It's a different thing that's happening now, which is our democracy will only survive if we can translate this into support for existing democracies elsewhere. And I think it'll be very different from something like, 20 years ago, the policy for a new, program for a new American century, when, the plan was going to create democracies out of, nothing. I don't believe people in the United States think there is such a thing as that anymore, but I think it is well understood that you can't be the only democracy on earth. So this is what I think is not well understood in China. But I think that the Sullivan, whatever we want to call this, expedition or a mission or something, the visit, I think the way the people it was composed of, the way they presented themselves, it may be possible for people in China to begin to really take seriously the idea that the United States is making a bit of a turn here. We're going to have to take some things more seriously, what they say. Other things we maybe won't take so seriously in what they say, but on this democracy issue, something is going on, and we might have to be attentive to that.
Sorry, Pamela, but something just came to my mind. Is it true, because I think it bears on what you've just said, that we now have a critical mass of American foreign policy officials who speak Mandarin? Because the Chinese have traditionally been very fluent in English, at least in the last 20 years or so. All of them read if I remember correctly, the Financial Times and the Economist, and but we've not been able to do that. And is it correct that we are starting to reach a more critical mass where Americans traveling there can also speak their language?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the critical mass is exactly, but I know that there's been a major shift in this particular way.
Hmm.
Up to, I would say, about now, right now in quotes. So I don't mean as of 10 this morning, but I mean sort of as of this sort of moment in time. Um, we have previous to this and going back to the Cold War had people who are known as China experts, China watchers, so on, and have had extraordinary influence over policy. I mean, just
Hmm.
what to me is like unbelievable uh, credulity, on the part of policymakers in the United States towards this fairly small number of voices. And it's always posited on this idea that, well, there are things that only a China expert can tell you. Um, I think that what has happened, particularly since the 1980s, is that gradually, um, knowledge of China has become more nativized in the United States. It's better rooted, it's more widely spread. Doesn't mean it's particularly profound, right? But I think this does alter uh, the role of so-called China experts in American policy now. So yeah, I think the Sullivan Group, it certainly included more Mandarin speakers than any previous group.
Hmm.
But it also, I think this is emblematic of this more generalized access, this more naturalized knowledge of China. And of course, you'll see this in Tim Walz, should he become vice president. You can see it probably now, right, in a bit of his presentations. It's just another one of those people who really has experience, lived in China, speaks Chinese, isn't overwhelmed by the idea of, oh my gosh, all that history, all that, how am I ever going to understand anything? So, uh, I think this is a big change, a subtle change at the moment. I don't think it isn't up in neon lights, but I think we will look back to about this time and say, yeah, this is when American policy towards China began to become more mature, more sober, more grounded, more casual in some ways. There is a difference coming on, I think.
It's fascinating to sit back and just think about this. I keep going back, of course, to the idea that trade and commerce is one of the, if not the key driving factors. I mean, if you look at China now, by all accounts, they are having a few really severe economic problems. I still find it very difficult to understand what is truly happening in America. One day you hear everything has gone up in price. The next day you hear the middle class, and so on. But all of this has to come together in some way after the election. Do you think that there will be changes fairly quickly on both sides? They'll adjust, or do you think it's going to take a year or so before all of this crystallizes and we start seeing some results?
Um, uh, Everything takes years, so yes, that's easy to see. But I mean, let me first of all just affirm, historically, yes, commerce has always been the basis of the relationship between the United States and China. And in fact, when there was this major change in the relationship, that it didn't last, but in the 1870s, but it presaged a lot of what happened at the end of the 20th century. It was explicitly based on commerce. We have the largest economy on earth, which was the Chinese economy, was still that way in the 19th century. And we have the fastest rising merchant nation on earth in the United States. And this relationship has to be cemented between the two of them. And in fact, that was the foundation of all Qing Empire foreign policy, basically commerce. And they tended to privilege that over military or strategic interests. And this has always been the United States relationship with China. It's always been based on commerce.
Fantastic. What a great way. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. But thank you so much for taking time. Your expertise is going to be increasingly valuable, I suspect. And I wanted to set the stage because the next 2 months, we're going to devote almost completely before and after the election to this whole issue of the impact and so on. So you've helped give us a framework for this, and I really appreciate that. And thank you for our viewers from around the world. Please join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship in the world, that between the United States and China, and its impact through the upcoming election, which itself is being called a generationally consequential election. Thank you again. Come back, see us. Until then, goodbye.